Hello everyone, today I wanted to just sit and have a chat about the book I'm currently reading, kind of old school, talk about rereading books a little bit, and also then because of the book I'm reading I want to go for a walk around the river, so I thought I would take you with me. I also really want to get a donut because I have been, basically there is my favourite donut place called Bread Ahead in London. They've placed in London Bridge, and I try and limit myself as to how many times I go, and I haven't been for months now, but it does mean that I'm kind of desperate. So my main reason is I want to go to the river because it's thematically relevant, and I want to get a Bread Ahead donut. They are my two motivations. But before I head out, I thought we would just have a chat. I feel like these are becoming like tea times with me. This looks really pale on camera, but it doesn't look that pale in real life. I'm drinking another Bird and Blend loose leaf tea. It's another one of my favourites. And this is Chocolate Digestives, and it's a black tea, but it's really biscuity. Obviously it's chocolate digestive. So if you haven't made yourself a cup of tea yet, please join me, pause this video, put the kettle on and have a cuppa. I realise my my tea times that I've created, when I say created, I've mentioned tea in now 2 videos, but that is the kind of the limit of the different types of teas I have in my flat. So if I'm going to continue, I need to up my game. But I love loose leaf tea, but like nice teas, like really expensive. My go-to tea that I have all the time is just a Yorkshire tea. This is the only tea, like normal tea, that I drink. I refuse anything else. Yorkshire tea reigns supreme. Before I head out, I wanted to have a quick chat about rereading books and the different reasons we reread. I also realised this is the first video I think I've actually made in 2022, and I find it really interesting that actually the first book I have been reading in 2022 is a reread, which normally I want to start the new year with a new book, and I always stress myself about the very first book that I read, or the very first book I choose to kind of pick up, you know, on kind of New Year's Day, because it has such a weight to it. But actually this year's read has completely like thrown me off course, because it was not a book I ever thought I would want to reread, and it was just not how I thought I would start the new year, even though it's been a really pleasurable way to start the new year, and has actually, I think, symbolised a lot of what I want my reading year to be. And the book in question is The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton. When I first read The Miniaturist, I was a bookseller at Waterstones, and I read most of this book either on the 453 bus, going to Trafalgar Square, or on the Bakerloo line. And it is a novel that I really associate with me moving to London, my first actual weeks in London, and my just kind of experience of travelling and commuting in the city. So it's a book that I've always had much stronger kind of location memory, or it has been attached to a very particular time in my life, and it's had significance because of that. But I actually didn't enjoy it the first time I read it. I wasn't into it. I wasn't absorbed in it at all, and I just thought it was like a 3-star read. But there's been something about The Miniaturist, and I've never really known what it is. I just always knew I wanted to return to it. There was always something that I wanted to reread, and like I hadn't quite finished my work with The Miniaturist, let's say. But sometimes when you've kind of got a book on your radar, what really helps, what really kind of pushes you over, is the fact that there's a beautiful edition. Whenever I think about talking about The Miniaturist, because I feel like I have a lot to say on the novel, and I'm like 8 years or so too late, one of the things that keeps coming up to me is my decision to reread. Like, why would I reread a book that I disliked, or that I didn't even dislike, I just found it uninteresting? Like, surely that is the opposite of a book you should want to reread. But I have actually had that experience before. I had it with Mrs. Dalloway, but it was slightly different. So when I first read Mrs. Dalloway, it wasn't the right situation for me to read that novel. But what kept happening is that years would go by, and images and symbolism from Mrs. Dalloway just never left me. I just kept thinking about them until I decided to revisit it, and then everything kind of fell into place. It was almost like I was missing a certain puzzle piece at the time, so I couldn't quite put it together and make sense of it. And the second time I happened to have that puzzle piece. And I feel like that is kind of the same with my experience in The Miniaturist at the moment. So I'd be interested if any of you have had that similar experience, because I think majority of the time when I think about rereading, I think about rereading my favourite books, which itself comes with another set of kind of anxieties. I haven't read Jane Eyre since I was like 11, 12. And I'm scared to read Jane Eyre because it was a novel that I formed so much of my identity on. My love as a reader, so much of that is from Jane Eyre, and I'm scared to read it in case I don't enjoy it or it doesn't quite stand up to this kind of big monument that I've created in my mind to that novel. I also have the experience of quite a lot of Jane Austen novels because it's been a long time since I read Pride and Prejudice, and I think actually I'd probably like it even more now. And even thinking about Jane Eyre, there are lots of novels that I've read that I first read, like Northanger Abbey, for example, I've read like 4 times now, and every time I've enjoyed it more. And the first time I really hated it, and I think I read it when I was just too young. It was the first classic I ever read. I wasn't ready for it, and I read it at university during my undergrad, started to like it, and then at my MA I loved it. And as time has gone on, I think I just kind of develop more understanding, and so I do have a history of not liking books, and then now I'm realising I have a history of not liking books on the first reading, but I guess it's a difference between like disliking a book and knowing that there's something in there that is waiting for you. But with The Miniaturist, I don't even think it's been that. I think it has just been so much of the elements of the story, the fact that it's set in Amsterdam, the fact that it is 17th century, the fact that it discusses women's agency, all of that stuff is stuff I love. So it's almost like I've kind of been thinking back to my younger self, being like, what was wrong? Like, what was so bad about it when it's everything you should love in a novel? I'd be interested if any of you have that experience of rereading. So not just kind of, you know, going back to like, I read Wuthering Heights nearly every year, just as a comfort read. It's a book that I love. Wuthering Heights is a comfort read, the darkness and depression. But I really love that book, and it's a book that I read a lot in the same way I read Mrs. Dalloway. Actually, they're my 2 most reread books, and I read those for a very different reason. And I don't know why I've returned to Wuthering Heights and not Jane Eyre, maybe because Jane Eyre is big and Wuthering Heights is just small. But I'd be interested if any of you, when you reread, do you primarily kind of reread your favourite books, or do you kind of reread some of the books that you think you would understand better at a different time? Now I've been thinking about all those books, particularly at university, that I read that I just didn't really enjoy. And in fact, there have been lots of books throughout my life that haven't been like books I've hated, but just have been ones that I've had no opinions on, which for me is worse than hating a book, because at least when you hate a book you have an opinion. And the books that I just meh, which I read, you know, a lot of them at university, and I mean the majority of ones I read at university I actually did like, and I felt like I enjoyed something, I got something from them, whether that was in terms of enjoyment or just kind of for academic reasons, because I was a nerd. But I am thinking that like is it time for me to go back and read more Henry James? Because Henry James in particular has just always been an author that I studied a lot that actually just didn't really get on with. So it's just kind of brought up a lot of questions, and I'd be interested to hear how you approach rereading, and whether it's something that, you know, you do every year and you set a rereading goal. I don't set any goals like that, but I find it interesting that I've started this year with rereading a book, especially that I read my very kind of first year of being in London, my very first job in London. It marks such a particular time in my life, and I realise that now I am reading it at almost like the opposite of that time. Like, I'm approaching the end of my time in London probably this year. I'm approaching now the career that I'm probably going to be in for a long time, that it just feels a really monumental, just interesting time for me to reread The Miniaturist. That's enough about rereading. Now I just want to talk about the actual novel, The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton. The Miniaturist is a novel all about agency, especially female agency in a very restrictive 17th century Amsterdam, a claustrophobic environment. It's a novel about progression, and I guess Nella, the main character, moving from kind of, being a young woman to being a wife, and moving from a rural area to a city of Amsterdam. With the progression of Nella, you also get her understanding of, when she's first given the dollhouse, she views it as an insult, that she's, rather than being the lady of the house, she's here to kind of play house instead. And then you kind of see her throughout the novel understand actually the power in which this society has over pretense, over how you present yourself to the world and how they're different, and actually her understanding of that becoming wise to how society works, how she can kind of manipulate the fact that she now understands those workings of society in the way that she herself has been manipulated by it, with her kind of setup of her marriage and the way she's presented to society as the wife of Johann Brandt. The key thing with this novel is just how claustrophobic it is. It is present tense, so you were right in the centre with Nella, and it's only over a kind of a time span of 3 months, so everything happens really quickly, and you were kind of swept up in this tale. What I've been really enjoying about the novel, which I don't think I picked up the first time, is actually just the unravelling of the characters and actually how they change after. And it's not about necessarily any downfall of any particular character, and it's not a kind of unravelling in a bad way, but it's almost seeing their reality for the first time, which is very different to the reality they've presented to us in the very beginning of the novel. In particularly with Marion, you have this kind of Mrs. Danvers figure, and then you realise actually that she's just incredibly wised up to how society works, and is actually probably quite tense about the whole thing, and you kind of view her character very, very differently, and it is, a progression of all of the different characters and their different arcs and the lives that they lead. In the unravelling of all these characters, it's kind of interesting to look at how much you knew at the beginning of the novel versus kind of the end, or how many kind of indications were there in the beginning, how many of them were actually kind of evident in the doll's house and which ones were hidden. The doll's house is obviously a main character in this novel, and it's when you're reading that you suddenly realise that actually things are making sense, but also things that are hidden. So there are parts of the house that don't exist in the doll's house, and the effort to which kind of certain things might be kept hidden. And I found it really interesting, especially from kind of a material culture kind of standpoint. You have this kind of symbol of opulence and wealth, a symbol of trade and a representation of kind of Amsterdam society at the time, and it was kind of interesting to think about actually as women, you get a sense of agency from your material culture or how you represent yourself in society. And I think the whole question of female agency, obviously with Nella kind of understanding as the novel moves on, the doll's house and the power it has. You also have the miniaturist, who's obviously kind of one of the main representations of female agency. A woman living outside of society, a creative, a woman of business, but also someone who exists outside of Amsterdam, someone who isn't kind of tied to the same restrictions as someone like Nella is. One of the most interesting shifts in this novel, and something that kind of Jessie Burton plays with, is whether the miniature is the one telling the story or Nella, kind of how she's perceiving them and kind of the story she's creating, and whether she is actually the architect of her own fortune, whether she is actually the one who is kind of getting a sense of agency from understanding society, from understanding the world in which she inhabits more as time goes on in the novel, and also how she's kind of, her interpretation of the miniature shift, as well as the interpretation of the miniaturist herself. Those shifts are the reason I'm really enjoying reading this novel. It is a story of morality and of hypocrisy, and of being stuck in very particular roles that you have to perform in life. Ultimately, at its very foundation, it is a novel all about performativity. Performative in terms of the doll's house presenting your best self, to Nella's understanding of what it means to perform being a good wife, and the differences between the romanticised imaginings she had and the rather different reality she now exists in Amsterdam. The novel is full of secrets, the secrets that we hide from other people and the ones that we hide from ourselves. It is a dark, twisty, page-turning historical fiction that I think really has a sense of Rebecca occasionally with Marin, but I think actually, you know, the development that all these characters have, you view them very differently by the end of the novel. So yes, I'm really enjoying reading The Miniaturist. It is very different to the experience I had, and I think it is just because I'm sitting and enjoying and allowing myself to kind of walk along the canals of Amsterdam. And on that note, one thing, because I've been reading The Miniaturist, I have no canals. In fact, I do have a canal not too far, but because I don't have working canals where I live, I've been kind of yearning to walk and read along the river. Personally, I think a walk starting at London Bridge and Doughnuts and ending with a walk along the South Bank and visiting the Foyles is the perfect day. So I hope you'll enjoy coming with me. Me from the past. I hope you enjoyed going on the walk that I am yet to go on. Thank you for watching this video. Thank you for always supporting my content, and I'll see you again soon with another video.